David Cameron is a British Conservative Party leader who served as Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, 2010-16. Cameron, a descendant of King William IV, was born into a family with both wealth and an aristocratic pedigree. He attended Eton College and Brasenose College, Oxford, from which he graduated, 1988, with a first-class degree in philosophy, politics, and economics. After Oxford he joined the Conservative Party Research Department. In 1992 he became a special advisor to Norman Lamont, then Chancellor of the Exchequer, and the following year he undertook the same role for Michael Howard, then Home Secretary. Cameron joined the media company Carlton Communications in 1994 as Director of Corporate Affairs. He stayed at Carlton until he entered Parliament in 2001 as MP for Witney, northwest of London. Cameron, young, moderate, and charismatic, quickly attracted attention as the leading member of a new generation of Conservatives. He was widely compared to Labour Prime Minister Tony Blair, who had acquired a similar reputation when he entered Parliament 18 years earlier. After just 2 years as an MP, Cameron was appointed to his party's front bench, making him a leading Conservative spokesman in the House of Commons. In 2004 Howard, by then party leader, appointed his young protege to the post of Head of Policy Coordination, which put Cameron in charge of preparing the Conservatives' 2005 election manifesto. The party, however, suffered a heavy defeat at the polls, provoking Howard's resignation. Cameron's self-assured speech at the party's annual conference in October 2005 transformed his reputation, and he was subsequently elected Conservative leader. Cameron sought to modernize the party and shed its right-wing image. He announced that economic stability and strong public services would take priority over tax cuts in the next Conservative government. Under his leadership the party grew in popularity and placed first in the 2006 local elections. It was the Conservatives' best showing at the polls in some 15 years. In the immediate aftermath of Gordon Brown succeeding Blair as Labour leader and Prime Minister in 2007, the Conservatives began to trail in the polls, encouraging the Prime Minister to consider calling a snap election to capitalise on Labour's momentum. By the time Labour held its party conference in September, it had taken a double-digit lead over the Conservatives. But, at the Conservative Party conference in early October, Cameron made an impressive speech, talking for more than an hour without a script. In reference to the upcoming European Union summit in Lisbon to negotiate a treaty on reform, Cameron lambasted Brown for ruling out a referendum on an agreement, contrary to the Prime Minister's commitment to hold one on a European constitution. In addition to other issues, Cameron also was critical of Labour's performance on crime and with regard to the National Health Service, NHS. Most daringly, despite trailing in the polls, he goaded the Prime Minister to call an election. So, Mr. Brown, what's it going to be? Why don't you go ahead and call that election? Let the people pass judgment on 10 years of broken promises. Let people decide who's really making the arguments about the future of our country. Let people decide who can make the changes that we really need in our country. Call that election. We will fight. Britain will win. The performance won wide praise, and in its aftermath Brown announced that there would be no general election before 2009. Later that month, after Brown had attended the EU summit in Lisbon, at which the 27 member countries agreed on the detailed wording of the treaty, Cameron followed up with his earlier criticism, arguing that Brown had absolutely no democratic mandate to sign this without a referendum. By December the Conservatives had taken a clear lead in the opinion polls, ahead of Labour by up to 13%, the biggest lead for the Conservatives since 1989. Get a Britannica Premium subscription and gain access to exclusive content. Subscribe now. The global economic crisis in 2008 helped Cameron solidify the Conservatives' position. Though Brown was widely praised outside of Britain for his approach to the crisis, his promise in 1997 that the days of economic boom and bust were overplayed to Cameron's advantage, as did an internal revolt by Labour ministers in 2008. In March 2009, Cameron made good on a promise to remove the Conservatives from the European People's Party, a mainstream alliance of conservative parties in the European Parliament. On June 4 the Conservatives topped the poll in the European Parliament elections, and Cameron had the Conservatives enter the legislative body as members of the European Conservatives and Reformists group. A parliamentary expenses scandal, which had been brewing since 2007, broke in May 2009 when the Daily Telegraph reported on widespread abuse by members of Parliament of expense accounts meant to offset the cost of having to maintain a second residence, the so-called additional costs allowance. The scandal cut across party lines, but Labour suffered the brunt of public criticism, and Cameron responded by arguing that the public had a right to be angry. Although the polling numbers for Cameron and the Conservatives showed a decline from peaks in early 2009, he and the party appeared to be well positioned for the general election on May 6, 2010. Voters gave the Conservatives their biggest seat gain since 1931, but the total still fell short of an outright majority. Days of political wrangling followed the election, with negotiators from the Conservative and Labour parties courting Liberal Democratic leader Nick Clegg in an effort to form a government. On May 11, after it appeared that the prospect of a Lib-Lab coalition would not bear fruit, Brown resigned as Prime Minister and was replaced by Cameron. He came to power at the head of a Conservative, Liberal Democratic coalition government, Britain's first coalition government since World War II, in which Clegg became Deputy Prime Minister. The two leaders seemed to quickly become comfortable with each other, perhaps because of their shared age, both were 43, and similar backgrounds. In June, Cameron addressed Parliament in response to the report of Lord Saville's 12-year official inquiry into the events of Bloody Sunday, which found that British soldiers had been responsible for the deaths of 14 nationalist demonstrators in Londonderry, Northern Ireland, in 1972, and that those demonstrators had posed no serious threat to the soldiers. The government is ultimately responsible for the conduct of the forces, Cameron said, and for that, on behalf of the government, indeed, on behalf of our country, I am deeply sorry. One of the cornerstones of the Conservative-Liberal power-sharing agreement was a pledge to formulate a budget reduction plan in short order. In October, the man whom Cameron had appointed Chancellor of the Exchequer, George Osborne, announced a 5-year austerity plan that included Britain's most extensive spending cuts in decades, notably reductions to welfare entitlements and layoffs of up to 500,000 public sector employees. Early in 2011, the Middle East and North Africa were swept by a series of popular uprisings that became known as the Arab Spring. In February, Cameron became the first Western leader to visit Egypt after Hosni Mubarak was ousted from power. Another event in the region, the revolt in Libya, particularly captured the attention of Cameron, who became an outspoken critic of ruler Muammar al-Gaddafi's brutal repression of the rebels in Libya. Cameron's calls for military intervention in that country, and especially for the imposition of a no-fly zone to protect Libyan civilians from Gaddafi's forces, were echoed by French press. Nicolas Sarkozy. Together they played a pivotal role in winning the UN Security Council's authorization of a no-fly zone on March 17. Shortly thereafter, a coalition of US and European forces with warplanes and cruise missiles began attacking targets in Libya in an effort to disable Libya's air force. The results of the May 2011 local government elections in Britain, especially those for local councils in England, appeared to indicate that Conservative voters were more comfortable than Liberal Democrats with the deficit-reducing austerity measures introduced by the government. The Conservatives made moderate gains to their presence in local government, but their coalition partners experienced their worst performance at the polls since the founding of the Liberal Democrats. In the wake of the election, relations between Cameron and Clegg and their parties were widely described as having become more businesslike in nature. This cooling of coalition camaraderie was largely the result of the Conservatives' active opposition to a Liberal Democrats-initiated referendum on a change from first-past-the-post elections to the alternative vote, which was strongly rejected by British voters. Following the Scottish Nationalist Party's overwhelming victory in the 2011 elections for the Scottish Parliament, Alex Salmond, the First Minister of Scotland, announced that he would be forwarding a referendum on independence. Cameron announced that he would respect Scotland's efforts in that direction but would campaign to keep our United Kingdom together with every single fibre that I have. When the scandal involving the illegal hacking of telephone voicemails by reporters from the News of the World newspaper exploded in July 2011, Cameron was caught in the fallout. Andy Coulson, Cameron's communications chief, had already left that post in January of the same year in the wake of the growing evidence tying him to the scandal. Coulson had served as the editor of News of the World from 2003 to 2007, when he stepped down after early revelations of the phone hacking came to light. Initially, Cameron had been supportive of Coulson after he left his government post, but, as the scandal deepened in July, Cameron said that he regretted having hired Coulson. Cameron announced on July 13 that a senior judge, Lord Justice Sir Brian Levson, would head a public inquiry into both the hacking scandal and Britain's system of media regulation. In early August 2011, Cameron faced a new challenge, as a profusion of neighbourhoods in and around London as well as in a number of other British cities erupted in riots characterised by widespread looting, arson, and destruction of property. The civil disorder was sparked on the night of August 6 when a protest in the North London area of Tottenham over the police shooting of a young man escalated into rioting, which began spreading the next day. "This is criminality pure and simple, and it has to be confronted and defeated," announced Cameron on August 9 as some 16,000 policemen prepared to take to the streets of London that night. Cameron also called members of Parliament back to London for discussion of the riots. In a speech on August 15, Cameron blamed a broken society for a slow-motion moral collapse. In a separate statement he promised tougher measures, especially against people living in rented social housing in the event that any member of the family broke the law. The Cameron government's first major social innovation started to bear fruit in September 2011 with the opening of the first 24 free schools, which were free to students and funded by the government but able to operate independently of local councils. The government enacted another major change in October at a meeting of Commonwealth leaders in Australia, where it was agreed that the British Crown could pass to the firstborn child, regardless of sex, and that the ban, more than 300 years old, on a British monarch's marrying a Roman Catholic was no longer valid. Also in October, the retirement age was set to rise to 66 by 2020 for public sector workers, and mandatory retirement was lifted. In December, Cameron took the nearly unprecedented step of vetoing a proposal supported by the other 26 EU heads of government to amend the EU's rules to reduce the risks of future financial crisis in the Eurozone. It was the first major proposal rejected by Britain since it joined the European Community. Unemployment in the United Kingdom began falling in the spring of 2012 and ended the year below 2.5 million, down from a peak of 2.7 million at the start of the year. Many of the new jobs were part-time, however, an indication that the labour market was not in decline but experiencing very slow growth. In July 2012, Cameron's government, like successive governments before it, sought to replace the partly appointed, partly hereditary upper house of Parliament, the House of Lords, with a chamber that had a more democratic mandate. With some support in all the major parties, the government proposed that the Lords be 80% elected, to single 15-year terms, and 20% appointed. On July 10, 462 MPs voted in favour of and 124 against the measure. The 91 Conservatives who opposed the bill, and the desires of the party's leadership, promised to join with Labour in voting against a timetable for the bill, guaranteeing that motion's failure and enabling the bill's opponents to use filibustering tactics to block it. Rather than face a humiliating defeat, the government withdrew the timetable motion and effectively killed its own bill. Because reform of the House of Lords had been one of the Liberals' highest priorities, Clegg, angry at Cameron's failure to deliver enough support to ensure that the bill became law, retaliated by withdrawing his party's support for a separate Conservative-advocated constitutional measure to reduce the number of MPs in the House of Commons from 650 to 600. Clegg said that the two reforms composed a balanced package that should stand or fall as a whole. For his part, Cameron said that there was fundamental disagreement between him and Clegg regarding the linkage of the two initiatives. In September 2012, Cameron sought to revive his flagging opinion ratings by shifting 4 of his least popular cabinet members to less prominent positions. Those moved included Health Secretary Andrew Lansley, whose reforms of the NHS had been attacked by almost every professional body representing doctors and nurses, and Culture Secretary Jeremy Hunt, who, many thought, had become too closely involved with leading figures in News International, publisher of News of the World, and who faced criminal charges related to phone hacking and the bribing of police officers. In October 2012, Cameron and Salmond signed an agreement on the details for the referendum on Scottish independence in 2014. The Prime Minister agreed to Salmond's timing of the vote, to the wording of the referendum question, and to lowering the voting age for the referendum to 16, and Salmond relinquished his demand for a second question that would have given the Scots the option of backing more powers for the Scottish Parliament if a majority of Scots rejected full independence. Opinion polls in Scotland at the time of the agreement found majorities of up to 2-1 against independence and for retaining the Union with the rest of the United Kingdom. Also in October, ahead of negotiations on the EU's budget for 2014-20, Cameron's government lost a vote in the House of Commons on his proposal that EU spending be allowed to increase only by the level of the inflation rate, in contrast to the majority of EU governments, which wanted a real terms increase. Labour MPs combined with a minority of Conservatives to demand a real terms reduction in EU spending. The vote, though advisory, was embarrassing for Cameron. In January 2013, Liberal Democratic MPs manifested their disappointment at Conservatives' earlier failure to support changes to the House of Lords by joining with the Labour Party to reject proposals to amend the boundaries of parliamentary constituencies that would have benefited the Conservatives at the expense of Labour and, to a lesser extent, the Liberal Democrats. In other areas, notably welfare policy, Clegg also rejected Conservative proposals and, because the Conservatives lacked an overall majority in the House of Commons, effectively vetoed them. Also in January, Cameron set out his plans for a referendum on continued British membership in the EU. He announced that if the Conservatives remained in government as a result of the 2015 general election, he would seek reforms that would return a number of powers from the EU to member states. Cameron said that he would put the outcome of his efforts to a referendum by the end of 2017, when voters would be asked whether they wished the country to remain in the EU. On February 5, the House of Commons voted 400 to 175 to legalise same-sex marriage in England and Wales. The bill, which Cameron had backed strongly, became law in July. The Conservatives and, to some extent, other parties lost support to the United Kingdom Independence Party, UKIP, in local elections held in much of the UK in May 2013 and in a number of parliamentary by-elections. Attracting more than 20% of the vote, UKIP, which advocated British withdrawal from the EU and far stricter immigration controls, established itself as the UK's first significant party to the right of the Conservatives with a broad appeal. Some Conservative supporters switched their allegiance to UKIP because it shared their rejection of some of the social reforms that Cameron continued to favour. Cameron, who had once characterised UKIP as fruitcakes, loonies, and closet racists, said that it was no good insulting a political party that people have chosen to vote for and that Conservatives were going to work hard to win back those who had supported UKIP. During the first half of 2013, the United Kingdom joined France in pressing the EU to lift its embargo on the sale of arms and other military equipment to Syria in an effort to support the opposition to the regime of Bashar al-Assad. In late August, Cameron sought to intervene more directly in the Syrian civil war by backing a proposed US-led strike against chemical weapons installations following a poison gas attack on suburbs of Damascus that allegedly had been launched by Syrian government forces. He recalled Parliament from its summer break for an emergency debate in order to secure approval for British participation in the retaliatory military intervention. The Labour Party and a significant number of Conservative and Liberal Democratic MPs, however, were reluctant to support action, as was the general public. As part of an attempt to modify his proposal so as to overcome the doubts of MPs, Cameron recast the vote on August 29 so that it was focused on the principle of military action and guaranteed that MPs would be granted a second vote, some days later, before British forces went into action. This meant that Britain could not participate in a U.S.-led attack according to the original timetable. Even so, 30 Conservative and 9 Liberal Democratic MPs voted against the government, and similar numbers abstained. Ultimately, the government proposal was defeated 285 to 272. It was the first time since 1855, during the Crimean War, that any British government had been defeated in a House of Commons vote on military action overseas. Cameron announced immediately that he accepted the result, that he would not seek to have the vote overturned at a later stage, and that the country would not take part in military action against Syria. In October, Andrew Parker, the head of the government intelligence agency MI5, indirectly accused the Guardian newspaper of jeopardizing the U.K.'s security following that newspaper's reporting of documents disclosed by Edward Snowden, who had worked for the US CIA and National Security Agency, NSA, that indicated that the British surveillance agency, the Government Communications Headquarters, GCHQ, had a far greater capacity to eavesdrop than had been publicly acknowledged. A fierce debate erupted between those, such as The Guardian and many MPs in all parties, who argued for tighter, more effective controls on the work of GCHQ and those, such as Parker and some newspapers and MPs, who felt that GCHQ needed as much freedom as possible to monitor potential terrorists and others who threatened British interests. Cameron joined Parker in condemning the leaks, maintaining that the activities of the GCHQ were lawful and necessary for the protection of the British people. Relations between the press and Parliament were also strained by the continuing repercussions of the 2011 phone hacking scandal. The 2012 public inquiry led by Lord Justice Leveson at Cameron's behest recommended a new, tougher system of press regulation, and dozens were arrested during a series of investigations regarding phone hacking and bribery of public officials. In October 2013, 7 people linked to News of the World faced trial for phone hacking, and 5 others pleaded guilty to avoid trial. That same month, the Privy Council granted a royal charter, which had been agreed to in March by Cameron, Clegg, and the Labour Party's leader, Ed Miliband, that established a new watchdog system that would give press regulators statutory powers. In June 2014, Coulson, Cameron's former communications chief, was found guilty of conspiring to hack phones, and in July he was sentenced to 18 months in prison. Although Cameron continued to promise an in or out referendum on the EU, the Conservatives had largely ceded the issue of Euroscepticism to UKIP. In May 2014, UKIP made huge gains in local elections and finished first in EU parliamentary elections, leading some Conservatives to suggest an alliance with UKIP. Cameron rejected the notion, stating that UKIP leader Nigel Farage wished to destroy the Conservative Party, not work in tandem with it. Cameron experienced a reversal within the EU in July 2014 when Jean-Claude Juncker, a candidate whom he had strenuously opposed, was elected President of the European Commission. That same day, Cameron announced the most significant cabinet reshuffle of his administration, appointing a group of ministers who reflected a markedly Eurosceptic outlook. Dozens of ministers were sacked or had their portfolios changed. Among those leaving government or accepting reduced responsibilities were Foreign Secretary William Hague, Education Secretary Michael Gove, and Ken Clarke, a minister without portfolio who had long been the most consistent pro-EU voice within the Conservative front bench. As September 18, the day for the referendum on Scottish independence, approached, the Yes side had gained tremendous momentum, and opinion polling indicated that the outcome was very much in question, though the No side held an edge. Only days before the vote, Cameron, Clegg, and Labour Party leader Ed Miliband jointly published in the Scottish newspaper Daily Record a pledge to increase powers for Scotland's government if the referendum was rejected. In the event, some 85% of registered votes went to the polls and convincingly defeated the referendum, with about 55% voting no and about 45% voting yes. In the wake of the referendum, having pledged to act quickly to make good on his promise to devolve more powers to Scotland, Cameron appointed an all-party commission to consider the details. At the same time, however, he wanted to bar Scottish MPs in the UK Parliament at Westminster from voting on issues that affected only England. After the House of Commons voted 524 to 43 on September 26 to approve British participation in the US-led air strikes against the Islamic State in Iraq and the Levant, ISIL, also called ISIS, insurgents in Iraq, Cameron stressed that the action would be limited to Iraq, that Britain would not attack ISIL in Syria, and that British troops would not be sent to participate in a ground war. In the run-up to the British general election of May 7, 2015, Cameron addressed concerns regarding the scale of immigration to the UK by promising to seek a revision of the rules governing free movement of people as part of his plan to renegotiate Britain's membership in the EU should he remain Prime Minister after the election. He also reiterated a pledge first made in 2013 to hold a referendum on continued British membership in the EU by the end of 2017 if re-elected. Right up to election day on May 7, 2015, opinion pollsters were predicting one of the closest contests in recent British history, with most polls putting the Conservative and Labour parties within 1 percentage point of each other. In the event, the pollsters were proved wildly wrong, as Cameron and his party won not only the largest share of seats in Parliament but also a slim overall majority, capturing 331 seats, a gain of 24 seats over the 2010 election, many at the expense of their soon-to-be former coalition partners, the Liberal Democrats, who watched their total representation fall from 57 seats to 8. At the same time, the Conservatives held off a challenge from the right by UKIP, which managed to win one seat, owing to Britain's winner-take-all electoral system, despite a stronger showing in the raw vote nationally. Labour's presence in Parliament fell from 258 seats to 232. On November 10, 2015, in a letter to Donald Tusk, the President of the European Council, and in a speech, Cameron outlined his goals for a restructured role for Britain within the EU. In reinforcing his desire that Britain remain within the EU provided that the reforms that he sought were met, Cameron said that reaching that goal would be challenging but not mission impossible. He sought reform in 4 key areas: 1. Increasing competitiveness by reducing regulations on businesses, 2. Limiting migration within the EU by allowing Britain to restrict tax credits and benefits for migrants, 3. Extending the powers of national legislatures and exempting Britain from measures aimed at achieving ever closer union, and 4. Creating protections for EU members that are not part of the single currency. In the wake of the Islamist terrorist attacks in Paris on November 13, 2015, Cameron asked the House of Commons on December 2 to reconsider authorizing British air strikes in Syria against ISIL. More than 150 MPs spoke during the 10-hour debate on the measure, on the eve of which Cameron had stirred controversy by reportedly commenting that those who opposed British military intervention in Syria were terrorist sympathisers. Early in the debate, Labour Party leader Jeremy Corbyn and other Labour MPs called on the Prime Minister to apologise for that remark. Cameron did not do so, though he did say that there was honour in voting for either side of the question. Cameron initiated the debate by asking, "Do we work with our allies to degrade and destroy this threat, and do we go after these terrorists in their heartlands from where they are plotting to kill British people, or do we sit back and wait for them to attack us?" Corbyn, who staunchly opposed authorising the bombing, as did most of his Labour colleagues, nonetheless freed members of his party to vote their conscience, and dozens of them joined Conservatives and others in voting for the measure, which passed 397 to 223. At a summit meeting of the leaders of the member countries of the European Union in Brussels in February 2016, the European Council reached at least compromise agreements on most of the reforms proposed by Cameron. Most notably, the British government would be permitted to limit benefits for migrant workers during their first 4 years in Britain, though this emergency brake could only be applied for 7 years. Britain was also to be allowed to base benefit payments to the children of immigrant workers on the cost of living in the countries in which those children remained. Moreover, Britain would be exempt from the EU's ever closer union commitment, allowed to keep the pound sterling as its currency, and reimbursed for money spent on Eurozone bailouts. When Cameron returned to London with the agreement in hand, he received the backing of most of his cabinet, announced that he would campaign for Britain to remain in the EU, and scheduled the referendum for June 23, 2016. There were, however, dissenters within the cabinet who made it clear that they would support Britain leaving the EU. Arguably the most prominent Conservative proponent of Brexit, as the British exit from the EU was popularly known, was Boris Johnson, the popular mayor of London. Cameron, who had already announced that he did not plan to seek another term as Prime Minister, quickly entered into a war of words with Johnson, who was widely perceived to have designs on becoming the next leader of the Conservative Party. In April 2016, Cameron came under fire when it was revealed that he, prior to becoming Prime Minister, had holdings in an offshore tax haven registered trust that had been created by his late father. That information came to light as part of a leak of more than 11 million documents, quickly dubbed the Panama Papers, from the secretive Panamanian law firm Mossack Fonseca, which exposed how a clutch of current and former world leaders as well as dozens of other politicians, public officials, and celebrities throughout the world had used tax havens to hide their wealth. Although Cameron had sold his shares in the trust before assuming office in 2010 and ostensibly had not violated any laws, the news was damaging for him because, as Prime Minister, he had taken a leading role in the fight against international tax evasion. Although opinion polling on the eve of the referendum showed both sides of the Brexit question fairly evenly divided, in the event, some 52% of British voters chose to leave the EU, setting the stage for the UK to become the first country to ever do so. An emotional Cameron addressed the country from outside 10 Downing Street on June 24 to announce his intention to resign as Prime Minister by the time of the Conservative conference in October 2016 to allow his successor to conduct the negotiations on the British departure. "I don't think it would be right for me to try to be the captain that steers our country to its next destination." He emphasized his belief that there should be no hurry about triggering Article 50 of the Lisbon Treaty, under which the EU and the United Kingdom would have 2 years to negotiate their separation. Johnson appeared poised to replace Cameron, but, in an abrupt turn of events, Johnson withdrew his name from consideration after he lost the crucial support of Justice Secretary Michael Gove, who chose to run for leader himself. After successive votes by Conservative parliamentarians, Home Secretary Theresa May and Energy Minister Andrea Leadsom emerged from the 5-candidate field as the finalists. They were to be put to a vote by all party members with the results to come in September, but, when Leadsom unexpectedly dropped out on July 11, the party's 1922 committee, which was steering the leadership contest, declared May the new leader, effective immediately. As a result, Cameron's tenure as Prime Minister came to a close even sooner than expected. Following Cameron's final cabinet meeting on July 12, Health Secretary Jeremy Hunt said that across the cabinet there was huge gratitude for what Cameron had achieved for the country and the way he's changed the Conservative Party. Cameron formally presented his resignation to the Queen on July 13. On September 12, 2016, he also resigned from his seat in the House of Commons, saying, "In my view, the circumstances of my resignation as Prime Minister and the realities of modern politics make it very difficult to continue on the backbenches without the risk of becoming a diversion to the important decisions that lie ahead for my successor in Downing Street and the government." Thank you for watching this video.